So, one of the main issues among the Orthodox, especially in Eastern Europe, I mean, the most Orthodox live in Eastern Europe, probably, yes, is what is called in the West consensus patrum. So,
Yes.
yeah, quite often it is used, to put ground under some modern positions, like it's a sort of justification for anything. If you believe that something has consensus patrum, some issue has consensus patrum, it means the issue is justified. So, what do you believe of that? Is consensus patrum in general, is it a myth or some sort of reality?
Yes and no. Now, let me justify that. Let me clarify this. Catholics and Orthodox, even more so than Catholics, take the tradition of the fathers very, very seriously. Now, this essentially means, in my mind, that we treat persons such as Maximus the Confessor, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Palamas, all of these, the ones that we can call fathers, even if it's not necessarily a technical designation, as if they were living theologians with whom we can interact today. So we read what they have left very, very seriously, as if it were, and it is, a contribution by one of the most respected theologians and or bishops who are still active today. So in that sense, we do not ignore it. Having said this, from an Orthodox point of view, from a theological point of view, we can criticize Catholicism because it finds some sort of security in the office of the Pope. And we can also criticize some Protestants. Well, I'm reluctant to say all Protestants because there are many different groups, but let's not get into this right now. Because they have raised Scripture into the ultimate authority. For the living Orthodox tradition, there is no other ultimate authority other than the person of Jesus Christ himself, as experienced and related to within the church community. So even if we take the Bible, our bishops or priests or the laity or the fathers very, very seriously, there's no other ultimate authority than the living tradition that we experience in the church. And that means that allows us to interact, as I said, with the fathers, but also to criticize them, to say, well, this is what Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, argued in the 4th century, knowing what he knew about his time, knowing what he knew about his science, about the science of his time, it's very likely that the same person, knowing what we know now about the universe, this, that, and the other, or might have conceded the point. And this is something we should this is something we see that the fathers do for themselves. And an example of this is, since I mentioned Gregory of Nyssa, who is one of the most philosophical fathers, and yet in the Council of Ferrara Florence in the 15th century, when some Catholics, in the context of a dialogue on purgatory, based some of their views on some of the writings of Gregory of Nyssa, Mark of Ephesus says, well, yes, we recognize that this is a genuine writing by Gregory of Nyssa, and yet we believe that the revered father was wrong in that case. So we have that kind of freedom in our tradition. So consensus patrum, yes, we take them very, very seriously, but we also have a certain freedom in treating them as partners in the dialogue.
Thank you. So, you mentioned the tradition.
Yes.
But in the Orthodox, we often, have the tradition and traditions
Yes.
from the smaller letters. Yeah. So, and what is the tradition for the modern Orthodox today? Is it a set of rules, or probably a museum with something that should be watched respectfully and treated respectfully, but still as you know, items in museum, or is it something living? And if it is living, it must be changing. But if it is changing, is it still a tradition?
That's a very good way to frame this. Something living. If we think, for instance, of a young organism, a child. A child needs guidelines to teach, to educate, to protect, and even more so, to open his or her horizons. So tradition does not need to be, does not only have to be something restrictive, but something that can inspire us to do more. But if we look, first of all, into the very clearly articulated message of the gospel itself, to begin with, and then we can say the same thing in the patristic tradition and in modern theology, we can see that there is a very sharp distinction between the law and grace, as St. Paul puts it. Repeatedly, we see that Jesus Christ goes against the letter of the law to bring in the intent of the law. This does not mean that church law or canon law or anything like that is useless, or it doesn't have anything to contribute. But there is always a deeper point there. There's always a point about understanding what that is, instead of following blindly a tradition. And perhaps, since I mentioned canon law, we can see that the most extreme case of abusing tradition can be found there, but also an antidote for that abusive tradition. What I mean by that is, in my view, as a theologian and as a priest, I think too often nowadays, perhaps the last couple of centuries or so, we lean towards a legalistic point of view, a mindset rather. Even, well, some that we criticize Protestants and Catholics for, but I think that that kind of legalism also appears in the East very often. But it is interesting, however, that for a very long time, for centuries, almost without without exception, when collections of canon law were published, such as the one published in the 7th century by the Queen Sixth, or even the Roger, the Pedalion, either in the beginning or the end, there is some guideline as to how to read these canons. And it's basically this, that all these are guidelines to be taken into account by the bishop or the confessor, who may apply them according to his own his own discernment. So, if if at some point we look at the Orthodox Church and we see that it has become a body that is mostly defined by laws, canons, and regulations, then we won't be able to recognize the Church of Jesus Christ in it anymore. We would rather instead recognize the Jewish tradition, what Christianity made a very sharp distinction from. But I think that we're not there yet. This is something that we have been struggling from the beginning. The church is an entity that exists both in this world and in the other world. So we struggle with things like that. It's an ongoing struggle, but it does contain the visible tradition and also the charismatic tradition that may allow us to understand it better.
Thank you for such a really deep answer. So, the 20th century, in a sense, was a century of orthodoxy worldwide, and one of the main shift within the Orthodox tradition during the 20th century was the coming of what is called by theologians and publicly too, I mean the broader public, the neo-patristic synthesis. Yeah, it's the phrase itself invented by Florovsky. So, however, the neo-patristic, the motto of the neo-patristic synthesis was forward to the fathers, yeah? Or it like that. I don't know how it's properly formulated in English, but something.
No, that's a very good way to.
Yeah, something like that. But however, this way of thinking, if we put it in a broader context of the Orthodox theology, it presumes that we have to do with the corpus patrum, with the fathers, in general, something maybe a little bit similar what at least some Protestants do with the Bible. Yeah, so but Christians have Old Testament, have New Testament. So we have the newest Testament being the fathers put together. So is it okay to go forward to the fathers?
I think you have framed it in a very useful way, and forward to the fathers is a very good guideline. Rarely would we encounter problems that in some way have not been touched by the fathers, but if we do, then we'll decide what to do then. But what I'm mostly interested in relation to this question is how you, in a sense, you distinguish the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Fathers as sources of information, advice, guideline, and/or authority. Now, something very interesting about the Fathers is that, for the most part, with few exceptions that were there for good reason, the Eastern Fathers never tried to write a systematic theology. John of Damascus does something like that, not exactly systematic theology as we find it in Aquinas, for instance, because he needed to clarify some things for the Christians of his time who were facing the invasion of Islam. So that's about it. And that also means that if we try to imagine that the fathers, the tradition of the fathers is a systematic or legal system of theology, we will see lots and lots of contradictions because they were not meant to give that kind of one prescription fits all. So the question there is not so much, or rather, this would alert us to the fact that, well, yes, we have the fathers. We look forward to the fathers. We can see very often unexpectedly. Well, I'll use the word with an asterisk, liberal positions in the fathers. But the question then is, how do we read them? How do I approach them? We, we should remember that very often they were writing in context, facing a particular pastoral problem that they had, or a particular philosophical or theological problem of their time. And if they were to face debates that are come today, we can't necessarily apply things that would not fit together. We have to, we cannot use them properly. We cannot benefit from them properly unless we try to penetrate the inner thought, not just what is the punchline. But as Orthodox, we would go as far as to say exactly the same thing for the Bible. The Bible is, for us especially, not a book that was meant to be studied at home. It was meant to be heard in a liturgical setting. And this opened the key very clearly. So that's how we approach it. That's how we experience it. So this, to not do this either with the Bible or with the Fathers is a methodological problem, in the sense of, and this is something that I use very often with my students, for the Bible, mutatis mutandis, we can use it with the patristic tradition as well. It is the same kind of methodological problem as if we take the text of Romeo and Juliet and we don't know that it's meant to be acted as a play. So we don't understand it. We extract the wrong conclusions.
Yes, that's very interesting comparison and very correct, I think. So today, I mean, it started probably with the Russian Revolution when, and probably even before that, when Turkocratia ended in Greece. But generally, it started in the context of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, when a lot of Orthodox came to the West, and which is not really surprising, but a great deal of Western people were attracted by the orthodoxy they professed. Probably they were the real reason was that for them the orthodoxy was the only link with their past, with their context and so on. But so they loved it more than they probably would loved it if they stayed at home. Yeah. So and. They started. I mean, the Western people, many of them started to accept Orthodoxy, to become Orthodox Christians. But accepting Orthodoxy, they also were moved to accept Orthodox cultures, because in Orthodoxy there is a very, the border between the religion, the faith, and the culture is really blurred, whether we like it or not. So, non-Byzantine Orthodoxy, we know. Well, my question is whether it is possible or not. We know it is possible, but in a broader concept, in a broader context, is it really possible to speak about God? I mean, what is called the God talk probably in the modern narrative, without being backed by our Byzantine past, outside of our philosophical and theological terminology and tradition, Can we have a so to say, non-Chalcedonian? I don't mean Armenian church or something like that, but not un-Chalcedonian, but non-Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. Is it possible?
Well, it is very interesting that you started this question by referring to the wave of Easterners, mostly Russians, to Western Europe in the beginning of the 20th century. The Russian diaspora, or the Russian philosophical theology. Now, of course, that covers a lot of people, including Bulgakov and Losky, that famous dialogue or disagreement, Florovsky and many others, and even the wave that migrated to America, such as Schmemann and Meyendorff. Now, why is this generation important for all of us, Russians and non-Russians alike? I think the main reason for this is precisely because they explored the second part of your question. They were intellectuals. They were not just simple immigrants who brought their culture with them. And they were interested in a dialogue, in a meaningful dialogue with Western Europeans and with Americans. But that meant that they faced a challenge that Orthodox theologians had not faced for a very long time before them. The challenge was to try to articulate their tradition, our tradition, in ways that could make sense to outsiders. And of course, by doing this, you understand your own tradition even better. So this was good both for outsiders and for Orthodox people as well. So we owe a lot to the Russian diaspora of the beginning of the 20th century, all of us. And I think what you're asking is whether something like that could be extended and expanded in our days. Well, that recent experience was an exploration, but I'll remember something much older. Now, of course, when we, regardless of our ethnicity, Russians and Greeks and Arabs and Bulgarians and so on, if we try to bring an example of the ultimate Orthodox community, we may very quickly think of Mount Athos. Okay, few people remember that until the 14th century, there was a community of Latins on Mount Athos, Benedictine monastery from Amalfi, and they were, of course, worshipping in Latin, next to their Greek and Russian and Bulgarian and other brothers, or these religions for a very long time, and nobody saw anything wrong with this. So, if we had the same conversation then, and you asked me then, is it possible for us to see a Christianity where different traditions worship next to each other and recognize each other's culture, religious culture? I would say, well, yes, of course, that's what we see it right there. But then the question is, why did that cease to exist? Well, no, let me correct myself. That carried on until the 13th century. So why it changed is because of the Fourth Crusade, when they, of course, that's a complicated story, but after the Crusaders took over Constantinople, then no Eastern could ever really trust Westerners. So that's politics. But would it be possible if we found a way to re-establish trust between East and West? And that's another complicated question, a very interesting one. If we're able to put some politics out of it, would it be possible, if we only refer to our Christian basis, to find ways to really have a meaningful dialogue with Westerners or with non-Chalcedonians, with anyone who is coming into the Christian tradition from the beginning? Well, I believe that it is our task that we should be able to do this. The task of every generation is to be able to reinterpret and articulate the tradition, the legacy we have been given, the biblical tradition, the apostolic tradition, the patristic tradition, in such a way that would make sense to somebody who is not of this tradition, so not just insiders. When you and I get together, or people in our church, we can talk about patristics, we can talk about Christology, we can talk about hesychasm, things that are quite well known in Christian or Orthodox circles. But we cannot assume that if we go to a different community and then we act as apostles in the wider sense, we can take all that with us and expect the others to make sense of it. We'll have to do what St. Paul did, who reminds us, I became all things to all people. So as the missionaries did and still do, we'll go to a foreign land or a different social setting, and we have to understand that language before we bring them our own contribution, which is the presence and life of Jesus Christ in the church.
Thank you. But does it apply? I mean, this missionary approach, does it apply only to relations, within a broader Christian cultural context, like, which embraces probably Catholics and Protestants and the Orthodox, of course, but we are all, we all have the same background, the Nicene background, Chalcedonian background. Yes, I mean, in this sense, all, because this patristic conference, that there are people of different, Christian confessions present here, but still the background is common. But what about the modern, or probably more properly to define it as modern society? Does it apply to them?
Yes.
Does it speak to them? Our fathers, do they speak to them?
Well, I think the challenge is greater, but the spiritual challenge, it can also be much more rewarding. Not just in terms of missionary work, that's the least of the concern, but also in the sense that in this way we live our tradition and our faith more strongly. Well, a word that is often applied in this context is post-Christian, which I don't believe is true. I don't think that there is such a thing as a post-Christian society. Perhaps we can talk about a more clear separation between the state and Christianity, but this is nothing new. We have seen that before many times. So is it possible for us to be in dialogue with an outsider, somebody who is, or a tradition that is not Nicene, as you said, or perhaps not even Christian? The challenge there would be for us to be able to explain who and what is Jesus Christ, who and what is the church and its value as a spiritual community, what is salvation, and if we can if we're able to articulate this in ways that are not just insiders' language, then I think it's beneficial not only for the outsiders but also for us. But this is precisely what some of the apostolic fathers did in the beginning. They started a dialogue with the philosophy of their time. They were in dialogue with people who had no understanding of um, the Hebrew tradition, the Messianic tradition, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the incarnation and the resurrection, and yet they learned their own language. So we see Christian theology almost from the beginning appropriating philosophical terms in order to explain itself. Things such as hypostasis, for example.
Trinity.
Trinity, yes. And of course, there are precedents of what Trinity meant in the ancient and the pagan world as well. So I think the challenge is precisely the same. How do we open this up to the outsiders? And the worst thing that we can do in this case is just to stay inward, to repeat tradition as if it were something inert, something dead.
Thank you. Can you briefly formulate what do you personally expect of this conference for yourself and for the church?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have to be clear that this is not a conference organized by any ecclesiastical body.
That's true. Yeah.
It is what is often referred to in a Western context a conference of a learned society, people who study the patristic tradition from all sorts of viewpoints. So we have Anglicans and Orthodox and Catholics and non-believers and almost everything here. This has been going on for quite some time. I forget if this is the 28th, I think, or conference of
today is the 22nd.
Okay, so 22nd. Every 4 years. That means that it has gone on for.
No, the conference is 28th, yes.
The 28th, okay.
No, the 18th. The 18th conference, not 28th, but 18th.
Okay. Well, it has gone on since, I forget the precise date, since the 60s or so.
It's got a long tradition.
Yes. And it is a tradition of looking into the legacy of the fathers and also of people, first of all, as theologians, and perhaps at a second level also as pastors. We can see many priests and bishops here as well. But first of all, as theologians, we can look into the legacy of the fathers. We can talk about it. We can disseminate our conclusions and our views. We can talk to each other. So at some level, this is a very healthy expression of ecumenicity, because we're not going to decide anything that has to do with jurisdiction, with politics, with anything like that here.
Jurisdiction.
But for this region, people are very free. People feel very free when they talk to each other, and we can see very very often that Anglicans and Catholics may go to the lecture or the presentation of an Orthodox. Orthodox and Catholics may go to presentations by Anglicans. So no statement of spiritual purity is required by anyone. So this is a kind of free dialogue that may establish also a healthy approach in ecumenical relationships. Well, of course, we have to remember that this is not a church conference, but the same people who are here, if they happen to be in a church council or in a church meeting with a different church, they'll bring with them the ease of communication that is established here as in the context of the learned society.
Thank you so much indeed.